Welcome to a homegrown family podcast where we grow the produce and the kids. Welcome to a homegrown family podcast. I am your host, Joe Metler. This is a homegrown family podcast where we talk about two primary components. One component being homegrown, which is basically anything from producing vegetables and anything garden related to pests in the garden. We've talked about diseases in the garden, and eventually we talk about some chickens and some hogs and raising cattle and things like that. We've also taken some time to have some family components in the Homegrown Family podcast, where in the past I've talked about family members of the past. My grandpa and grandma, my parents, and the types of farms they grew up on. Also, in the future here, some of the family components will consist of homeschooling and different types of things of child rearing. So anyways, jump on board here to talk about any of those types of things. So far, we've been focusing a little bit more on the gardening component of things recently. So we're going to continue with that general trend today. I recently attended the field day for the NDSU Carrington Research Extension Center that's located in Carrington, North Dakota. And at this field day, they also have like a fruit day that they kind of break off into an agronomic section and then the fruit tree section. So I attended that section. They had talked about anything from growing apples to pears to Juneberries to Hascaps to aronia berries to currants, all these different types of fruits. All right, I'm not going to go over everything they talked about, but one of the things that have been interesting, or we have been trying to get into, my brother David and I are growing some pears in our orchard back at my parents' farm. And this year, my brother David had grafted on some of my uncle's pear trees onto some rootstock. And so we're trying to grow those right now, get them started in his basement underneath some grow lights and things. So I thought that was very interesting. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about pears in northern hardy climates, folks. So upper Midwest, we're talking zone 4 primarily, and zone 3. Zone 3 is what my parents' farm is too, so it might be challenging for us. So at this field day, Gretchen Merriweather was kind of their guest speaker. That was primarily their expert on pears. She is the owner of Sweetland Orchard in Webster, Minnesota, about 45 minutes south of the Twin Cities. I'll post a link in the show notes here, but you can contact her at sweetlandorchard@gmail.com, or I'm sure if you searched, Sweetland Orchard, you can find that and learn a little bit more about her and her orchard there, which is pretty cool because she has an orchard. And then she also has a cidery / Perry, the pear version of that. And then she also typically uses hogs to grow and forage in and amongst their apples and stuff. So that's pretty cool, I think. Something that we might try here one of these days. But so this podcast here, if you're interested in growing pears in the northern Midwest, this is the podcast for you. And just to, clarify here, I'm not a professional pear person. I'm not an expert when it comes to pears, but I thought this was a very, very interesting topic. And so I'm just kind of sharing it with you guys today on some things that I learned and some things I just know from my background, education, and knowledge. So I guess if you're looking at growing pears here in northern Midwest, you have to have a couple of different things to consider. What's your end goal? Are you trying to just raise a couple trees for a single family? Are you trying to produce an orchard business? Are you trying to produce a cidery or perry for pear ciders or something like that? What are you trying to support? Are you trying to do a U-pick kind of thing or whatnot? So you always got to have your end goal in mind. You should probably do some kind of economic analysis to whatever makes sense. So things to consider, if you're looking at just for a single family, you typically can't grow just one pear tree. You have to have multiple pear trees. I recommend at least 3. So that way they can cross-pollinate and they'll actually bear fruit. There are certain types of cultivars that may produce fruit without having a secondary pollinator. And I've heard that the patent pear tree could be a self-pollinator. It may not self-pollinate every year, but it could self-pollinate. But you want to grow a couple different cultivars or varieties of pears. So you don't want to plant just 3 patent pears. You want to plant a patent pear and then maybe something else like a Parker or Nova or something. And I just threw out some different cultivars out there. But you want to plant cultivars that have similar maturity levels that are going to bloom around the same time of year. Because if one blooms 2 weeks before the rest, well, that one's not going to bear any fruit. So you kind of want to keep that in mind even if you're just planting a couple trees. But my interest aligns more with planting several, trees, maybe dozens of trees. And so even for that situation, you do need to have pollinator trees still. And I think I heard that you can have up to 8 trees in a row and then pile a pollinator. Every so often you'll want a pollinator tree in either your high density or your traditional planting. And then another thing to consider is your rootstock or your cultivar selection. What are you going to actually plant and hope to achieve with those different cultivars? And so I have mentioned that we're upper Midwest here. I'm focusing on zone 3 and zone 4. And Carrington is actually still zone 4. If you look at the state of North Dakota, it's like broken into fifths almost. And the southern 3/5 of North Dakota is all zone 4. And you kind of hit Fargo, and then there's a big, huge dip in the zone 3 coming through the central part of Minnesota where my parents are. So when it comes to cultivar selection, I'm just going to break it down into 2 simple categories of a soft pear and a firm or a hard pear. Now, there's many different, I think there's like 10 or 12 different types of cultivars, some originating from Russia, some originating from Asia, and this and that. But to keep it simple, there's a soft and a hard pear. And so your soft pear is going to be like your Bartlett's that you buy in the store. They're basically going to ripen. They're going to kind of get that mealiness texture to it that pears can get. And they become soft, right? And they get squishy if they're sitting on your counter too long. Then on the other hand, you have hard pears that will actually stay hard, kind of like an apple. Maybe not as crispy as an apple, but pretty close. And they'll actually stay crispy until they get kind of bruisey and soft from old age. But they'll take a bite into it and it'll kind of be apple-like in texture. And so you have soft pears and hard pears. And any type of pear that you see that has like an Asian style pear, that's usually a key giveaway that it's going to be a harder or a more firm pear upon picking and maturity. I mentioned the Patton is a hard pear, considered an Asian pear, and it stays hard at harvest. Summer Crisp is a popular pear that will turn soft like your Bartlett's. That's a little bit more winter hardy. The Juicy Jewel out of the University of Minnesota has an Asian style pear, so kind of the harder style, crossed with a Summer Crisp, which I just mentioned, but it's more a pear style, so it didn't maintain the hardness of that particular cultivar. So, anyways, you kind of want to double check those types of things when you're looking at cultivar selection. I'm just going to go through a couple of these different cultivars that were grown at the Carrington Research Farm there. And some of the successful pears that they've had good luck growing are the Nova. And I'm just going to kind of read the descriptions on a couple of these. The Nova, which is you pick at light green and refrigerate room temperature before ripening. They're juicy, tender, and delicious fruit. The Patton, which is also one I mentioned earlier, is a later cultivar. You pick at light yellow and refrigerate, you eat, but it'll spoil at room temperature. Or pick greener and let ripen in cold storage. A crispy pear. And there's also the Stacy, which also grew well in that zone 4. As far as maturity, it's uncertain, but it ripens fairly early, approximately August 20th to August 30th. But they pick before ripe and they ripen in cold storage. So anytime you pick a pear, if you wait till it gets soft on the tree, it's almost too late. At that point, it's over mature. It's ripe to the point where it's starting to go downhill. I was fortunate enough to work in some orchard work in Washington on Bartlett pears, and they pick those when they're so hard and green. Ship them in cold storage, get them to the store, and then they ripen. Kind of jumping around here a little bit, but so there's soft fruit and hard fruit, and double check. Asian style pears typically hard. So get what you want there. But then you also have to consider the type of rootstock that it's grown on. And there's not a whole lot of winter hardy rootstock cultivars for pears. And I guess what I mean by rootstock is that you have to grow a rootstock. You have a root pear tree and then a scion wood of a desirable cultivar that you graft onto that rootstock. You do the same thing for any commercial production for trees and orchards and apples and things. And it's pretty common to do that, so that way you have a winter hardy base growing in the ground and in the soil, and then you have your desired cultivar that's actually taking branch and becoming the fruit of the tree and bearing the fruit of the tree. The rootstock will also determine how large a tree gets. So if you have rootstock that's going to be a full tree, well, then you're looking at a 20-foot tall pear tree. Not necessarily desirable, not necessarily easy for picking, right? You have different cultivars that are considered dwarf cultivars, where it'll be, a 6 to 8 foot tall tree for a pear or an apple. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of dwarf rootstock in pears that are actually winter hardy that can survive zone 3 and zone 4. So some of the cultivars and rootstocks that Gretchen Merriweather mentioned about, she had mentioned 2 different types of rootstocks, the OHF87, which is a 75% full-size tree when you get to full maturity. The earlier or the smaller the trees are, a full-bearing, full-size tree rootstock, or 75% of the tree-size rootstock, or dwarf-size rootstock, the smaller the trees get and the rootstock become, the little bit earlier the plants will mature and bear fruit, in terms of sometimes it takes 10 years to get fruit off of a pear tree. Well, if you're getting a 75% size of a rootstock for a full tree, then that 10 years turns into 7 years before you bear fruit. And if you get a dwarf rootstock, maybe you got 5 years before you bear much fruit. So that's what I mean by that. And then the other one that she mentioned was, as far as a rootstock, is OHF97, which is 100% the size of a normal sized tree, but it's fairly winter hardy for this area. Places that you guys can go to get these cultivars and rootstocks are fedcoseeds.com. Out of Fedco, it's a nursery. You can go to St. Lawrence Nurseries. The website is slngrow.com. And then you have Schlabach. There's not necessarily a website for that place from what I hear, but you can request and call for a catalog. Their number is 585-798-6198. And you can get a catalog, you kind of look through some of that stuff. The Schlabach place, they'll actually let you put a pear variety on top of a certain choice of rootstock, which is kind of unique to some nurseries, because a lot of nurseries might just give you, hey, this is what you get, this is the cultivar you wanted, and you might get some generalized rootstock on the bottom. But if you want to mix and match certain types, that might be the nursery to go to. And so then Gretchen did leave me a tier 2 or a handout at the field day saying different types of cultivars that she likes to use and has grown successfully in her orchard south of Minneapolis. So some of the cultivars that she's tried out that have grown relatively well. First, I guess I'll say she did break it down into zones, and Summer Crisp is a zone 3, and Patton is a zone 3. All the rest of these she lists as a zone 4. She had relatively good success with Danby, Gourmet, Jung, Lucius, Nova, Parker, Schroeder, and Hardy ND, which is a Northern Dakota cultivar, which is pretty cool. There's quite a few different cultivars that come out of South Dakota State University and the University of Minnesota and University of Iowa. So there's some good ones. Some that she listed that are perhaps not zone 3 tolerant, but zone 4 tolerant, that are used for perry or cider making, are Barland, Black Knee Red, Thorn, and Yellow Huffcap. Perhaps not winter 3 hardiness zone, but definitely zone 4. So that's if you're interested in the cider pears. But I'm not going to get into a whole lot of the cider type stuff here in this podcast here, or this episode. So a lot of the pears, got to harvest as they're maturing, not as they're ripe. But there are a couple pears that are good right off the tree, or cultivars that are good right off the tree, and that's Southworth, which is firm at harvest, and then you put in cool storage to let it ripen. And then another one is also Hudar, which are also pears that are pretty tasty, potentially right off the tree, and are firm right off the tree, and are pretty good to eat crisp if you like the crisp style, or the hard style, I guess. Hopefully that gives everybody kind of an idea of some different types of pear cultivars that they could use and grow on their farm or their yard or whatnot. So I talked a little bit too. So we talked about quickly just the end goal, what's your game plan, cultivar selection, rootstock. But I also kind of wanted to get into different planting styles. So you have traditional planting, where you have 20 feet between trees and you grow a full-size tree. Some of the pros there is that it's not very, it doesn't cost a lot to put together. The number of trees that you buy is not very many for the acreage that you can cover. But you're also producing a lot less fruit per acre than what you would if you were doing like a high-density planting. It's a little bit harder to harvest. You might need taller equipment, ladders and things like that, but initial cost is very low. The other kind of system is a high density trellis system. And Gretchen kind of talked a bit about this a little bit as she was kind of doing her presentation or talking to the crew there that was there. And she does a 5-wire trellis system that's about 10 feet tall, and she plants her pear trees 3 feet apart with 12 feet between rows. Big enough to get any type of equipment down the rows. 12 feet is usually pretty adequate. 3 feet apart I thought was really close. I guess it's more common to do about 4 feet apart, but she has learned that the closer you put them together, the less large the trees become. So then a 10-foot trellis is big enough. They won't grow much taller than 10 feet. And then if you use that 75% size of a full tree rootstock, that being the OHF 87, then they don't tend to grow the full size either. So a little bit of competition among plants reduces the general overall size. Some of the cons with the high density planting is that the cost of the wire, cost of the poles, the trellis system, upfront cost is quite large, but super easy to harvest. You can go up and down the rows, no problem. And you can even almost harvest both sides of the row from one side because it's not a very thick tree, not a very thick, system. It's probably 3 foot thick by the time you're done with the season. And then you trim it back and you prune it and you kind of keep it close to the wires. And you train your branches. And so there's a little bit more labor intensive, and then you have to do a lot more training. There are training with traditional setups and just general training with pear trees in general. You can't just let them put them in the ground and hope they're going to do well. You kind of got to spread them out and get them to form the way that's most conducive to high yielding fruit. So there's a lot more labor with the high density planting up front. Initial cost is high. The biggest pro here is a greater amount of economic return overall. And that's what Gretchen was kind of focusing on, as far as that being the best perk for high density pear trees. And so right off the bat with high density pear trees, you need to start training right off the bat. Start, attaching your trunk to the first wire that's probably about 2 feet off the ground. And then you got to start growing them out sideways, and then once another 2 feet later, they start going sideways again. And you got to train them down like that. Otherwise, the trellis system's pointless. But I've heard that if you train a pear tree downward a little bit, it'll actually bear better fruit or more fruit. That's one of the things they mentioned at this thing. So yeah, that's kind of the general gist, I guess, of pears. There are many different things you have to do to upkeep them. I don't think you want to fertilize them heavily by any means, probably a little bit of upfront. But we didn't really get into that at this field day. Some other comments in general that I thought were interesting is that you have to thin the fruit as well. So, you'll have clusters of 5-6 blooms or 2-3 blooms, and then they'll start setting seeds. They're all like little penny size or dime size little, nuggets of pear on there, right? Well, you want to thin those down to only one fruit per cluster. Cluster being that node that's bearing fruit, that little bunch of blooms or little bunch of apples there. You want to thin it down to one at most. And maybe even after that, if it's really heavy bloom, you want to pull full bunches off. And kind of, so that way the pear tree will put more energy towards those single fruits to allow for bigger, juicier fruit rather than a bunch of little tiny small ones that people just make jam and jelly out of or a pie because it's not a very fresh handful, fresh eating pear. You don't pick when it's mature, you pick when it's mature, not when it's ripe. So if you wait for that pear to basically be soft on the tree, you gotta eat it like that day. If you pick it when it's mature, physiologically mature, at stem separation. So if you were to grab a pear and move it a little bit, against the grain of the stem, and if it's holding on, it's not ready. If you do that and it snaps, pulls out, comes off, and you're good to go. I've also heard that when the lintel sills, those little grains of dots on the skin of the pear, when they go from that yellow-green color to a slight tinge of brown, can also be a good indicator of when to harvest your pears. I mentioned pruning. Pruning takes place in the wintertime, February, March, when you can make a cut on a tree. The reason they do it in February, March in the cold weather is that there's no insects around to put vectors of diseases, bringing bacteria to those cuts. And so they'll kind of heal on their own come spring, early season before all the critters and the pests come out. according to this field day we had here, is that sometimes you can prune pear trees after harvest. And that will reduce your water sprouts and the regrowth after harvest, potentially resulting in less pruning the following year. Or that winter, less pruning in that winter. I'm not sure what I think about that. I mean, it's nice to have a lot less regrowth happen and occur, but I think if you're fertilizing correctly and not over-fertilizing, you won't have a whole lot of water sprouts. The water sprouts, on the base of the trunk of a tree, you'll have those extra sprouts of tree that come up or branches. Those are considered suckers and are kind of similar to water sprouts in that they just take up extra energy that the plant doesn't need to exert. And the water sprouts are the actual branches, coming off the main branches that are basically new growths from a single year growing straight up. They're not coming in at like an angle off the main branch. They're going straight up and down, and those are oftentimes just taking up space for airflow for adequate airflow in and amongst your tree. It's taking up extra nutrients that's not necessary because it's not a bearing limb. It's not that the water sprouts don't bear fruit. At least the first year, if possible later on, but they're just taking up energy. So you can clean them off. That's the type of pruning, I guess, to do it after harvest. Not sure if I like that idea, just because it does allow a lot more vectors of diseases to come in and infect that plant as the pests and insects are still alive and surviving. One of the things they talked about in this field day also was renewal pruning, which I've never heard of before, where they basically take the oldest branches and prune those. So you might have your main trunk, but once you get another branch coming off, they might cut back some of your old trunk and put a new smaller branch and train it downward towards that wire. And so, I don't know. My brother and I, we train our grapes. We haven't done a lot of apple training yet. Slowly we have, but our grapes, you always leave the oldest vines there and you trim back to the old vines every year and then new sprouts come out versus the renewal pruning. Anyways, look it up. The renewal pruning is an interesting concept to me. Not a pro at it, but definitely interesting. Then lastly, I kind of wanted to just chit-chat quick about some different pest problems or things that can happen in an orchard that they mentioned. Sun scald, is going to cause one side of your fruit to get riper quicker than the other. So sun scald will burn and not fry off, but it'll damage and injure one side of your fruit, not the other, which also causes uneven ripening. I guess a solution for that is to spray a little spray paint gun, 50% white paint solution or gray would work too, and you just spray it on your exterior parts of your fruit that you can see from the exterior part of the tree. And that's supposed to prevent some of that sun scalding happening. Fire blight is also a big one. Fire blight is a bacterial disease that needs to get pruned off. I won't get too in depth on fire blight. The University of Maryland has a good guideline to ugly pruning method, which is a way to prune off your fire blight while maintaining the best possible outcomes for the remainder of the tree. So basically it looks like you have a healthy tree, everything's green, but then on the edges of some limbs there'll be a bacterial infection that will cause drooping and wilting, and next thing you know it's all brown and it dies. And so to get rid of that, you basically clip like 6 to 8 inches below where that dead zone is. And then sanitize your pruners and go on to the next limb and the next tree in between each cut to prevent the further spread of the disease. Usually you can see a bacterial ooze if you were to take your pruners and snip in between the dead area and kind of look at it and kind of touch the two dead ends together that were kind of starting to die. You'll see an ooze of bacterial grossness, right? So that's one way you can kind of tell that's fire blight. I'll post some different links onto the show notes here for you folks to kind of take a look at. Because, like, again, I said I'm not a professional, pear grower, but just sharing some information. Let's see. Another problem is voles. Your mice and your voles can kind of come in and chew off the bark of your trees and girdle them and ultimately kill your trees. And so that's something that my brother David and I have been struggling with. We've tried different paint mixtures and things like that around the base of the tree. We tried the tree guards, the plastic tubes and things like that. From this field day, I've learned that they kind of use the 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch wire. I oftentimes see those in like rabbit cages and pens and stuff like that. but, make your circle go around the base of the tree, but actually bury that wire in the ground like 3-4 inches so that the voles can't dig up and underneath your tree guard and make that guard their living habitat. So that's the next thing we're going to do. Also, we put down plastic in our orchard too, and that just insulates a place for the voles to live. And so I think anytime we grow a new row here, we may avoid that as well. Yeah, so that's, I think, a couple different things. Shoot me an email if you have any questions. I can try my best to answer them. Check out the Sweetland Orchard. I'll shoot a link in the show notes. But she's got some cool stuff going on, Gretchen Merriweather. I'm sure if you shot her an email through her website that she'd be happy to share information on how to get started and maybe cultivar selection and things like that. I did mention the fire blight, and so I just wanted to actually, Gretchen gave a little sheet here saying which ones are maybe a little bit more resistant to fire blight. So you may want to look in cultivars such as that as well. She has said that she has not had a lot of fire blight there, so she's been lucky. But it can decimate your orchard if you don't get on top of it. Let's see, Conference is a pear cultivar that is resistant to fire blight. Kiefer, Uer, U-R-E, and Warren. The U-R-E one cultivar is out of Manitoba, established in 1978. So, that's got to be a really good winter hardy one as well. It's a cross between a Siberian pear and a European or a common pear. So, yeah, small fruit. Well, they don't store very well, it looks like, according to her notes. But they're resistant against fire blight. So if you know that you have fire blight in your area, you can try one of those cultivars, or perhaps just use that cultivar if it's similar to other cultivars that you want to in terms of flowering timing. Make it your pollinator tree, and then at least you'll have a couple pears to enjoy. And then Danby is also another one that's resistant to fire blight. So yeah, definitely, that's probably one of the biggest diseases you got to worry about is fire blight. So if you can get a cultivar that's resistant to that, you're just that much higher up on the game. So I have a book here. I think it was written in 1991 that I've been finding interesting. And you learn a little bit more about pears and things. It talks about different cultivars in there as well, but they're obviously older style pears. Older cultivars. But the Summer Crisp is mentioned in there, so I'm thinking that's one that's probably a pretty good one to utilize and use. It's called Growing Fruit in the Upper Midwest by Don Gordon. I'll post a link in the show notes there too also, but it's a book that I think I'm going to be using here for reference here, and have been. So enjoy the references and the resources, everybody. Please feel free to rate my podcast. If you're listening, great, that's awesome. A lot of people will just stream the podcast. If you do me a favor and download it and then listen, you don't necessarily have to do that, but it gives me a little bit of an idea. On the Budsprout website, the host platform that I use, I don't know who's all listening unless you download. And so if you stream my podcast episodes, I don't necessarily know how many, people are listening from where, this or that. But not that that's important, but it does make you feel better when you get more numbers listening to the podcast. So feel free to do that, to rate, and to leave any comments on the listening platforms. Yeah, I think that's what I got for you today. Hopefully, those of you who are interested in pears learn something new, or those who are just curious also learned something new today. I know I did attending this field day, and this field day is usually present and occurs every year here in July in North Dakota. So if you're wanting to learn more and curious, attend these field days. There's oftentimes orchardists that are currently in the game, attending these things to get any little type of bit of information. There's one guy I met there that was retired NDSU horticulturist someplace. I think either the main station here in Fargo or something, but I learned a lot of information from him too, just on side conversation. And so, yeah, take advantage of going to these field days and things like that, or, attending a Master in Gardeners program to learn more about this stuff. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you everybody for listening.